And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us, where you'll find links to our YouTube page, our podcast page. We're always trying to clean it up, always trying to get caught up. And of course, our Liberty News Center, where links to organizations affiliated with the ACLU, with the Libertarian Party, and a variety of good government groups, from Common Cause to local political groups. Their news releases and their news can be found. So take a moment, check out the site, and if you could, please take a moment to like or follow us on any one of our social media sites. Anyone who's watched this show in the past knows that we are profoundly grateful to and always in admiration of the work of the American Civil Liberties Union. And it was they who brought to us what is clearly a provocative and highly troubling situation right here in the state of Rhode Island in our correctional system. We'll get onto that in a little bit. That was how I got to know our guest that's just joining us. But at the same time, she also represents an organization that's on the vanguard of civil rights and civil liberties. In this case, folks who are facing challenges in their life, folks who might be facing physical disabilities, and making sure that their legal rights are represented. Of course, I'm talking about Morna Murray. She is the Executive Director of Disability Rights Rhode Island, and she's joining us for the first time. Morna, thank you so much for coming on board.
Oh, thank you, Pat. I really appreciate it.
Just to give you an idea, a little bit of the background, Morna is a graduate of the George Washington University, as well as the George Washington School of Law. She has led and organized several groups surrounding around civil rights for folks with disabilities, and joins us most recently from the state of Connecticut, where she was in charge of the Connecticut Department of Developmental Services. So she brings to Rhode Island a lifetime of expertise, both in the practice of law, in, shall we say, the making of the sausage up on Capitol Hill, having worked for a United States Senator. We're gonna ask you a little bit about that, and of course, bringing all that to bear on the rights of the disabled here in Rhode Island. It's an impressive background. How did you find yourself coming to Rhode Island?
Well, it's interesting. Life takes you in different places. You can't always predict what's going to happen. When I left Connecticut, I left the state working and running our agency. I spent a little time sort of collecting myself and deciding what I was going to do next in advocacy, and also wanted to be out of government. That was my one stint of actually being inside of government. And so this opportunity sort of popped up, like these things happen in life. The Protection and Advocacy Network, I don't think that many people are familiar with it or know it as what it is. So Disability Rights Rhode Island, which was formerly known, and I think it's probably known to most people in Providence and the state as the Rhode Island Disability Law Center, we are part of a national network of what are called protection and advocacy agencies, P&A for short. So the P&A system is a federal system. It's federally mandated by Congress. We get federal funds. Each state and territory has a P&A agency. They go by different names, but increasingly, states are, interestingly, calling themselves or changing their names to, as we have, disability rights and the name of the state. So we want to be recognized as a network across the country and the territories, and that's part of what we're doing. And like you said, we're here to speak for the rights, the civil rights, the human rights of people with all kinds of disabilities, whether it be physical, developmental disabilities, mental disabilities. That's what we're there for. We do operate under pretty specific guidelines from the federal government in terms of our funding. So sometimes people think that we are something of like a legal services organization where we just take in everyone. We don't have the capacity to do that. We have an incredible staff. who are so talented, but we don't have the capacity or resources to take every case that comes our way. So one of the things we really appreciate having the opportunity to do is a case like the one that came to your attention with the ACLU that we filed last week. It's an opportunity for us to work on an issue that hopefully creates change for a large number of people. We can have a bigger impact that way.
Before we get into the particulars of that case, I want to get, if you will, a sense from you, a snapshot, if you will. If you were to report on the state of disability rights here in Rhode Island, what type of report card grade would you give it currently?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm sort of new, so I don't want to get myself into trouble. I don't want to be unpopular before I even start. I think Rhode Island is, struggling like a lot of states are struggling. There's good parts and bad parts. I don't want to be mamby-pamby about it, but we have a consent decree that came down in 2014 from the Department of Justice, and that was basically about, and we're still under it, and that had to do with a problem that many, many states are facing, having to do with the kinds of day services that people with disabilities get, and whether they are actually integrated into the community in a way that they can be and should be, or whether they're segregated in, places where they really don't get to experience life or companionship or, just regular life in the community like you and I do. So that's a problem.
Because I just want to jump in there.
Yeah.
A lot of folks, when you mention disability rights, they're typically focusing on, unless they've got someone in their family who's challenged, they're typically focusing on physical access issues. Is something compliant with ADA? Can they get into a building? But it's really a much broader array of issues than that, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, we would address issues like that. I can't say those are simpler or easier, but they might be a lot more clear-cut, because we're dealing with a violation of the ADA, something, a building is not accessible or something like that. But no, we cover the gamut of issues for people. Any legally related disability-related legal issue that comes under what, again, we have to do each year as a P&A, which is set our priorities for that particular year. They carry over from year to year, but we do have certain priorities. And I should also add that we have both individual case priorities, and then we also have what people call system priorities, which, again, we'll talk about the case in a little bit, but system priorities meaning system change on a larger scale than just an individual case.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the importance of integrating folks with physical challenges into day-to-day life. That is a process that, as I remember, started some 30-plus years ago in a real sense. There's been a variety of terms, mainstreaming applied to it. Why in the year 2019 is that still such an issue? I personally, just a brief anecdote, I'm probably a little bit older than you. The high school I graduated in, I'll put a number today, in 1978, way back, we're talking 40-plus years ago, was the new high school in central New Jersey where I lived, and they had an entire building designed for young children, high school age, who were, in some cases, profoundly handicapped. So part of my everyday life was going to the cafeteria and sharing academic classes with folks who had serious physical challenges. And so I grew up just, no nobility there, just being, acclimated to it. It was, I'm not, and yet in the 2019, we meet people who are still shocked when they see people who are facing these challenges. Why is this still an issue?
Boy, that's the $6 million question, right? Why? I should kind of acknowledge at this point that I am a parent as well. So I have personal experience. I have an adult son with autism. So I see it from all sides, and and it's why I've devoted my professional career to this kind of work. Why are people with disabilities not fully included in every aspect of our society? And they should be, and they can be. And it seems to be, not to get too esoteric about this, but, it seems that people are just still afraid of anyone who is different, and it takes a little bit more work, and we have to do things that might seem a little uncomfortable. I can tell you that, and this is a little bit off the topic, but it's, not too long ago, I remember my son was in first grade, and one of the first tastes I had of this, and how subtle it can be, is my son could blend into any group. And I try not to talk about him very much because he's an adult, has a right to privacy, but in first grade, he was getting assistance in school. And I started volunteering just because I wanted to know what was happening. And there was a young kid in his class in first grade who had severe autism. Now, we've all seen folks that have autism or other developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities. They don't necessarily speak the way you and I do. They might call attention to themselves. They might do awkward things. They might make awkward sounds. Long story short, one of the moms in my son's class came up to me one day telling me that they were starting a petition to have this kid moved out of the classroom. Would I join in? And I think that might have been when my career in disability started, because I was so flabbergasted, and also knowing that could happen to my son.
Right.
And that she was talking about a person who had very similar issues to my son. It just wasn't quite as visible with him. And, why is that? I don't know. I just don't know. I know that we just have to keep working at this, and I don't know when it will end. I'd love to be out of a job.
Right. I mean, unfortunately, when it comes to any group of people who might be, and I'll use the coalition air quotes, different, and that could be a religious issue, a different method of learning. It could be a physical issue, anything that renders them different. Unfortunately, as a society, there are too many situations where we refer to what I use the term "the." It's the disabled, it's the autistic.
Right.
And unfortunately, it seems like until it becomes personal, and someone in your family, someone in perhaps a new member of the family by marriage, then all of a sudden you see the humanity in these folks and the fact that they aren't any really different than us, that people become converted. It's tragic in the year 2019. That's a constant theme on the show. How do we end up here? Why are we still here? It's tragic that that has to happen. So what are a lot of the challenges you see right now? And by the way, I'm taking this from a positive perspective. I mean, because I think at this point, part of the way you get better is acknowledging, not dwelling on it, not trying to assign blame, not trying to use it in a pejorative manner, but simply understanding, recognizing, talking about issues we face. It sounds so cliche, but it really is the first step, proper recognition towards solving this. So where do you see challenges on I'll call it a Rhode Island global scale so far, in your brief tenure here, I should say?
You mean in terms of specific issues that we need to change? Well, I think, again, and not to pick on Rhode Island in particular, but since I am in Rhode Island now working, it's very similar to other states in that there is, I mean, it's no surprise that the state is a bureaucracy in terms of the government. It's difficult to get things done. There's not enough money to get things done. Making sure that people get services that they're entitled to get through state funding and state and federal funding together is very difficult. We do, I mean, on the good side of Rhode Island, and again, I'm an amateur at this, so you can tell me more about that, but it's very small. People know each other. I've been at hearings where people are acknowledging that they've known each other since kindergarten. I mean, that's a beautiful thing, really, when you think about it, that people have such histories with each other, and there's such a sense of community. In that sense, I don't think you can beat Rhode Island and a town like Providence. I think I mentioned to you when we were talking before, I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Right.
Very, very similar. I feel very much at home in Providence. My daughter went to school there many years ago. And so in that sense, there are some really good things. But back to challenges, I just think that money is a huge challenge. Having a greater need than there is resources to address that need. Mm-hmm. As cliche as that may sound, it is the universal issue with respect to people with disabilities. The need far outstrips the funding. For many years, state governments have been talking about what they call natural supports, which is just a fancy word for saying free or family or friends.
Right.
Developing natural supports for people with disabilities because there isn't enough supports that we can get funding for. That's not easy to do. Some people are lucky with the lottery of birth to be born into families that have lots of people in them and live in communities where they can walk places and be welcomed. Other people don't. So, it's very individualized. That's the other thing. Like any group of people that's marginalized, there's nothing really uniform about the individuals that make up that group. That's a big theme of what we do, is that, help or accommodations or support or plans or whatever it is has to be individualized to any given person. So the challenges, to sum it up, they're pretty universal. They're not that unique to Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And Rhode Island has a lot going for it in terms of addressing these challenges. A lot of truly, truly wonderful people who are committed to this issue.
Right. Yeah, and to the money issue, I mean, clearly a lot of this falls down on the individual school districts, and individual school districts have a clearly different track records. In our next segment, we're going to have a gentleman on who's an educational activist who has compiled more than, shall we say, anecdotal evidence that an employee of that school district was eligible for bonuses based on how low or how few IEPs were performed. Now, my God, why? If your child is in need of an IEP, then they need it. It's we're paying a lot of tax in this state for schools, and there should be no artificial incentive to prevent that from that. In other school districts, just dyslexia, we had there's a state activist, Jody Stone, who's very, very active in dyslexia issues. And full disclosure, my wife is a teacher who has in the past specialized in that issue. There is plenty of lip service in the form of legislation guaranteeing certain services and guaranteeing rights, yet it remains very much an individualized battle, often hand-to-hand combat almost, if you will, with the individual school district or the individual municipality that they, by accident of birth, happen to live in. And I guess my concept of your mission is, in addition to looking at the overall picture and prescribing policy, is to be a reactive force for situations like that. So in what situations would it be appropriate for parents, guardians, to seek your services, and what exactly is it within your mission to do?
Well, generally speaking, our mission is that we're helping people with disabilities to achieve full inclusion, to exercise their civil and human rights. What that means in specific terms, and I'm glad you mentioned the word guardian, because that does come into play in our work in a significant way. We identify priorities. So, I can talk about some of our priorities, but
sure.
Essentially, one of our biggest priorities right now, and has been for several years leading up to now, is behavioral health care for people in the correctional system in Rhode Island. We also focus on supported decision making. There was a law that passed signed into law by the governor in this past July on supported decision making by people with disabilities, and we do not support guardianship, frankly, for people with disabilities. We do understand that there are situations where people might need a guardian, but we do believe that in the vast majority of cases, people can make their own decisions. They don't need their rights taken away from them, and with the proper supports, they can have a team of people that help them to make their own decisions without losing their rights about certain things. Certainly, we work and try to help people and students and young people in the school system, as well as teenagers and young adults that are making a transition into young adulthood. Another priority that we have is keeping people from being hospitalized for undue periods of time, which can happen because of the fact that we don't have enough placements and places for them to live safely in the community necessarily right now.
Right.
And that's, again, a problem in every state across the country. But the amount of time that people can end up hospitalized because of behavior that results from having a disability can be shocking. And that's something that we're focusing on this year. We also look at the rights of people that are receiving Social Security benefits, making sure there's no exploitation of them. We have specific funding for doing that, looking into how their money is being spent, what kind of control is they still have over it, and that kind of thing. We are definitely involved in safeguarding the rights of people to vote and to be involved in the electoral process, and that's certainly a priority for us this year during a presidential year. So that's just a sampling of some of the things. We also help people with assistive technology in terms of gaining it, or if they're having trouble getting it, and issues regarding employment. It's a wide variety of issues.
And how much of a staff do you have here in Rhode Island?
Well, we have 12 people on staff. We have 6 attorneys, and then a variety of other staff members. Mm-hmm. In terms of the P&A system, we have a small state, obviously. We're what's known as a minimum allotment state, so we really don't get a lot of funding for what we do. Right. In terms of the need, we could have double the funding that we have and still not be able to meet the needs of everyone who calls us. So.
And at the risk of using an out-of-date term, literally the range of services you just described are literally cradle to grave, in some sense.
Absolutely.
So you are also I believe, if I read your literature correctly, you are also listed as a not-for-profit and a charitable organization. So folks can, if they benefited from your services or not, folks have the opportunity to donate to your cause to help things out. And I hope I can help you spread the news on that, because that would be wonderful to spread the news on that. We could use all the financial assistance that we can get, and it is something that I want to start focusing my time on, as well as to do some serious fundraising, because we really do need more resources in order to serve the community. Right, because at the same time, and when you're talking about a northeastern state, the financial stakes for, I would imagine, a lot of your client base are higher than ever. You're facing generationally, in some cases, end of life for parental involvement issues, and as you've got the aging, you've got this crazy combination, if you will, and some of it obviously very good. The fact that folks are living longer with physical disabilities than they ever have, but in some cases outliving their literally their support network. So you've got issues surrounding that. I would imagine it's just endless, the demands on your time and your organization's time. It really is, actually, and you raised such a good point. When I was working in Connecticut, that was one of the most poignant demands placed before me as the head of our state agency by parents in the community, was their fear that they would, and very real certainty that they would outlive their children, that their children would not have what they needed without them once they had passed on. And a lot of times, and again, our mission and what we do goes well beyond just people who receive state funding. But very often, we're dealing with
folks that are getting Social Security income because of their disability, or they actually may be funded by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, or have other Medicaid funding, and it's just not enough, and there's also long waiting lists for services in the state. There's long waiting lists for the Office of Rehabilitative Services, Rehabilitation Services, and for the Developmental Disability and Mental Health Services. And so you hear often in states parents with the refrain that, they have to wait until they've died before the state will even consider their children to be an emergency. And that's true as well, because there's just not enough funding to go around. I don't want to harp on funding, but
no, it's part and parcel of our daily life. And of course, the frustration here. And again, I will not pretend to be an expert in your field of expertise, but clearly it's common sense that any efforts we can make to mainstream folks, to integrate them into society, to allow them opportunities at a young enough age to encourage continued development in some level of employment, will only help minimize the downside of other issues where you've got a support network aging out. It's really common sense.
It is.
It's a pay me now or pay me later type of calculation.
I mean, that's true across the board, right? I mean, you can say you might not be an expert, but what you just said, it encapsulates everything that we're doing. Why do we not pay to make sure that kids are diagnosed at an early age and receive the services that they need early on so that they don't need as many services later? I mean, it just, like you said, it's just plain old common sense.
Right. Yeah. And that, of course, when you look at the politicalization of every issue now, without getting into national politics, everything has become, a battleground for ideology as opposed to human compassion. I'm a libertarian, so obviously I look to, and this is the important part, the difference between, say, a social conservative and a libertarian, I look to not just limit economic participation by the government in these issues. I look to simultaneously grow, hopefully even beyond where government participation once stood, private participation in these issues. Because I think we need to bring our culture back to a point where folks felt it was important to involve themselves in issues that may or may not affect their daily life. So, we are a community, and these folks, we simply can't, we're not Sparta. We simply just can't leave these people out in the hopes that they'll go away, because they won't. And we only continue to exacerbate the situation.
Yeah, and the other thing in addition to that is we're leaving them out in total ignorance of how they enrich our lives, how they enrich their lives and our lives and everyone's lives. I often say that I have learned more from my son about being fully human than I have learned from anyone else in my entire life, and that is absolutely true. So, there's studies upon studies that show that the workplace is improved when people hire people with disabilities, that their work ethic is stronger than, other employees. I mean, you hear story after story, like what you were saying about how unless you have a family member or somebody marries into your family, or suddenly, something happens and you have a personal experience with a person with a disability, that humanization of the person with the disability is difficult to achieve. Mm-hmm. And so even though what we're doing, the legal advocacy and systems work and all that kind of stuff has a lot of technicalities to it, mm-hmm. When I talk about it, I really try to be as human as I can be, even if it sounds simplistic, because it is fundamentally about human compassion and inclusion. And in so many cases, really, in any case where people with disabilities are denied full inclusion, we are the ones that are missing out. Mm-hmm. We are missing the richness of the human and very diverse human experience that being with people that are different bring to all of us. So, not to be on a soapbox about it, but unless you've experienced it and are involved in it, you don't really see it, It's not rocket science.
Right.
My son makes our family a very different unit of people than it would be without him, and we're much better people for it. So,
no,
and I know most families will say that. So,
no, it's revelatory once you encounter that phenomenon for the very first time. It's really beyond most people's experience until they have that opportunity, and it should be seen as an opportunity.
Exactly.
As opposed to, ascribing it to it the pejorative. So I obviously I applaud your efforts, and I mean that's why I wanted to give you an opportunity and take the recorded form of this and put this out there to people to give it a chance to really understand what the work is. It isn't all about lawsuits. It isn't all about educational policy. The human element in this cannot be and should not ever be denied. Because, again, ultimately, it is an expression of our humanity, how we as a culture take care of, or if you will, let's just say not take care of, let's say facilitate, if you will, the experiences and what contributions folks in that community can make. And we're better for it. We find ourselves, however, at this time, we got to know each other, if you will, because, well, of the need, if you will, to challenge parts of government. I think I called it on the phone. We've got a lot of experience in this state with what I call town councils gone mad, or town councils gone wild. But for whatever reason, despite the established presence of case law, despite clearly enumerated best practices, which are evolving, but clearly there are baseline best practices, we find governmental bodies almost routinely involved in either facilitating or ignoring predatory behavior, which, as often as it is targeted at those folks who are seen as the weakest among us. And I emphasize seen as, because my personal experience has been that folks who find themselves with these challenges, whether they be early onset in childhood or later in life, are usually true warriors who overcome challenges that you and I, well, I'll speak for myself, that I can't even imagine. So, this type of predatory behavior, when it occurs at a governmental level, is, I'll just leave it at that. Let's talk about, I say this with a smile, but all the respect, let's talk about Miss Liberty here. What is happening with our correctional department, and if you can give us an overview and exactly then what the case stands for.
Well, isn't that interesting that we ended up with a case called Liberty versus Rhode Island Department of Corrections? So we didn't plan that, but that's the caption for it. We have been for years now looking at the conditions at the Department of Corrections, as we call it in Rhode Island, the ACI, the Adult Correctional Institutions, and noting the use of solitary confinement, and in particular, because of our work, the use of solitary confinement for people with mental disabilities, for mental health issues. I would love to talk in detail about some of the conditions that we have witnessed and talked with people about. Our attorneys have been down at the prisons in Cranston, for months on end, for years at this point, talking to people who are suffering from mental disabilities, mental health issues, and being punished with a form of correctional, tools, for lack of a better word, that amounts to, and I will use this word, and I'm not using it hyperbolically, amounts to torture for people with mental illness. The UN has said it, so I guess I can say it too. The UN has compared solitary confinement and the use of solitary confinement as inhuman, degrading treatment that amounts to torture. And it to me and to a lot of people around the country to advocates, but most of all, by far, to the people who are experiencing this, it is a form of torture. It does not serve a remedial purpose. It does not make anything better. It does not save anyone any money. It does not prepare people to come back into the community. What it does do is it aggravates people's mental health issues. I mean, stepping outside of our particular constituents for just one moment, people that don't have mental health issues have been shown to develop mental health issues because of and as a result of being placed in solitary confinement. So back to what is this all about? Well, we've joined forces with the National ACLU, National Prison Project, and Rhode Island ACLU to bring a class action lawsuit on behalf of people who are suffering from this use of solitary confinement in Rhode Island in an effort to get it to stop. We have some very unsettling and profound statements about what is happening with people, what has happened to them, what continues to happen, what they experience in solitary confinement. It really is inhuman. It's hard to believe that it's going on.
What, now, I believe, how many plaintiffs are there besides Ms. Liberty?
Well, we have 6 named plaintiffs,
right.
But we're in as a plaintiff as the PNA as well to represent all people that are subjected to solitary confinement. I know that the national research shows that about 1/5 of the prison population in any given year experience solitary confinement. So 20% of people in Rhode Island, that's about 3,000 people total. So 20% of that. And, the other thing is that, we think of solitary confinement as, I think the average person, from the movies or whatever, you think like people get thrown into solitary confinement because they're acting up or they're doing something, and, they're out in a few days. That's not the case. There are people that are stuck in solitary confinement for weeks, months, even years. We have a plaintiff who was sentenced to 365 days, and that was held over. I mean, how it's possible to sentence someone to 365 days of solitary confinement is beyond me. That in and of itself should be a signal, like, what we're doing is not working. Otherwise, we wouldn't be taking one person and telling them that for 1 year they're going to be in solitary confinement. Like, what are we doing wrong here? But it's just degrading, humiliating, inhuman treatment.
And what are some of the, what are some of the effects, if you will? I mean, how does it manifest itself in some of the plaintiffs?
If I could, I would like to describe just a little bit about the conditions so people know what we're talking about.
No, please do.
We talk about a solitary cell. How big is that? Like, size-wise, you think about a parking space for your car. That's about how big a solitary cell is. In that space, people have a sink and a toilet, and they have to eat, sleep, urinate, and defecate in that one space, 24 hours a day. Lots of times the lights are on 24 hours a day. People that have experienced mental health issues, have family members with mental health issues, they know that sleep is critical to any kind of recovery. Sleep is just about impossible in solitary confinement. The lights being on all the time disorient people. They don't know what day it is or whether it's night or day. They have almost no recreation time, and if they do, they're in cages that are akin to something like large dog kennels. One of the worst things, I think, and most mind-boggling aspects of this is that people with mental illness that have been put into solitary confinement receive almost no mental health care. So in Rhode Island, they call it, and I don't know where this term arose from, but quote-unquote cell front encounters in which a staff member is shouting through the little slot in the door that they slide food into the person who's in solitary. They're shouting through that slot to the person who's inside, and that's the extent of mental health treatment that might happen for an inmate that's in solitary. And, of course, they're telling our folks that they're not going to be talking about anything meaningful in an environment like that.
Right.
But the research that's been done, the psychological effects of being in solitary confinement are very real. They're documented. It's an exacerbation of symptoms that people are already suffering. There's a decompensation that happens, and the kinds of things that people experience include anxiety, ranging from just plain old stress to full-blown panic attacks. People get depressed, very seriously depressed. People may have increased anger response, and that can range from being irritable to becoming violent because of being stuck in solitary confinement. They might have cognitive disturbances that, like I said, mentioned the disorientation, but they can also experience hallucinations, literally from being in this one little room 24 hours a day, all the time with no human contact. People can become paranoid, and they can experience psychosis, and worst of all, can be an increased risk of suicide and other forms of self-harm.
Right.
People in solitary confinement can go literally for months without touching another human being. I mean, it is literally inhuman what we're doing.
What would you say to people, and they're out there, who almost take this childish, malevolent, we showed you, you deserve it, to hell with you attitude towards people in that situation?
You mean people that are saying that they deserve to be in solitary confinement?
Right. I don't give a damn. These people are the worst of the worst. For me, it speaks to the power of, if we believe in the power of redemption at all, this clearly doesn't speak to it. But I'm curious what your thoughts are for someone who's so intimately involved with it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, one of my responses is that please, I'm not saying this to you, but to the general you, somebody who would think like that, please educate yourself about the people that are ending up in solitary confinement. Because, and again, I can't speak to the population at large. Our focus is on people with serious mental illness. These are not the worst of the worst.
Right.
These are people that could be you and me. That I grew up with "There but for the grace of God go I." People that got themselves into trouble or ended up in a downward spiral and are suffering from mental health issues that cause them to act out in public or do something aggressive or whatever the case may be, do something impulsively, get arrested. We have a friend at Disability Rights Rhode Island who had, a psychotic break in public and was incarcerated and put into solitary confinement. The speed at which these events unravel is almost impossible to convey, and once they do, it's very difficult to walk them back. I think that's part of what people don't understand. And a lot of these folks, are not doing well in their lives. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of support. And so what happens, they have no one to advocate for them. They have a very difficult time advocating for themselves.
Right.
Someone who has mental disabilities who is wealthy and has a large circle of support could still have a difficult time advocating for him or herself, but they don't have to worry about that, because they have resources and they have people who are supporting them.
Right.
What happens to people when they don't have that?
And this is why I think it's so critical that conversations about all the aspects of your organization mission be had as frequently as possible. I like to use the term MythBusters. There are folks who become part of the pipeline to prison, and let's add in the strong potential for substance abuse as being one of the ways they got there, and then think about the impact of inhumane prison conditions impacting a combined, double whammy, if you will, of mental issues as well as substance abuse issues, one literally feeding off the other.
Exactly.
And then what have you got? What have you created? And the real question is it our governmental policies, both in the correctional environment and elsewhere, in the war on drugs, that's literally, in part, responsible for creating these folks' situations? Everyone will always assign to someone else 100% personal responsibility, but we all, I would have thought, again, here with the common refrain on this show, in the year 2019, which, by the way, the show's been on the air for 6 years, so I started saying in the year 2013, in the year 2019, when we are making quantum leaps in how we address mental illness and our understanding of it, and when we are making quantum leaps in our understanding, at least increased understanding of substance abuse and some of the issues surrounding that, how is it that government in of itself could be personally responsible for creating a whole new set of issues? And I'm using that euphemistically.
Exactly.
I just don't understand. In conversations like this, I try not to play the libertarian card that often, but quite frankly, as someone who's never been impressed with government, I just see, anyone who's a fan of Downton Abbey, saw a very sugar-coated version of what British prisons were like. In the
exactly.
And the term, but you have to wonder how much progress have we actually made when some of the same techniques, tools that were used in 18th century England are still part of our prison life today in the year 2019. It never ceases to amaze me how. And again, a common refrain in the show is, "I've seen the enemy, and he is us."
So true.
We as a cultural society are the ones directly responsible for exacerbating conditions in which people who are perhaps prone to issues of mental challenges and or have been handed through the fates of life physical challenges, we as society and a culture and a government are uniquely liable for exacerbating the horrific issues that these people have to confront on a day-to-day life. So so getting back to the case now, you've announced a lawsuit. Now, I mean, the history of the Rhode Island prison system is not one without lots of consent. Consent decree is almost the former administrator's middle name. I mean, what is the objective here, right? In terms of damages, in terms of correctional issues and changes in approaches, what are folks looking for to have happen?
Well, we have that's detailed in the complaint, but essentially what we're looking for declaratory and injunctive relief, which is a fancy way of saying that we want them to stop using solitary. We want prisoners and inmates to get better health care, better mental health care. We want more resources dedicated towards prevention and rehabilitation and training for people that work in the prison system so that they can be better able to if this doesn't sound too Pollyanna-ish, serve the needs of the people that are under their care while they are incarcerated. I mean,
right.
One of the things that we detail in our complaint is the fact that RIDOC seems to have its first response is the use of force when confronted with someone who may be acting on the basis of disability-related behavior. Instead of being trained in techniques to recognize signs and symptoms of mental illness. So there's a lot of things that need to be done, all along the lines of, like you were just talking about, really addressing the symptoms of the problem, not exacerbating it. When you look at the fact that about 95% of people who are incarcerated return to the community, it does make, to go back to your point about common sense, it is just common sense that we would spend money to help them do that and become, members of society in a functional way so that they don't return again, so that we're not paying even more to incarcerate them, so that, they are prepared to go out and not come back, that they are prepared. And that's just from a dollars and cents point of view, but let's look at it from a moral and constitutional point of view. We really do have an obligation to help people, and especially people who are so vulnerable that, in my opinion, this is opinion, let me just, disclaimer here, this is not in the complaint, but are in prison, are in jails, are in cells because they have mental illness and haven't had the proper support. And so, why aren't we helping them get back to where they could be living decent lives? 95%. Very few people stay in prison. So why make them worse when they're in there? Just for a whole host of reasons. Doesn't make sense. Plus, it's just wrong,
Yeah,
wrong.
there's that whole "it's just wrong" thing that sometimes we have to remind ourselves of. Have you gotten a reaction yet from RIBCO, the Rhode Island Brotherhood of Correctional Officers? Do they have buy-in to that? Are they part? The term that's abused this year so often is stakeholder, but in a sense they are stakeholders in the correction of the correctional system. Have they been invited to the table yet?
We have not had any formal, interactions with them. No. I mean, we haven't, there really is no table to sit down at yet, although we would like there to be one. And we have tried up until filing the lawsuit to engage in negotiations with RIDOC, with the correctional department, and we did not succeed in doing that.
So in a sense, you really were very often, from folks who should know better but don't, see the ACLU as lawsuit happy, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. The ACLU invokes yeoman's efforts in order to prevent litigation.
I can't tell you enough about how hard we worked not to bring a lawsuit. And in particular, when it became clear we would have to bring a lawsuit, making sure that that every fact was double-checked, every single thing that we put into this complaint was serious, verifiable, and, in terms of being able to bring this action legally, we have to go through what's known as, exhaustion of administrative remedies. And I can tell you that process was extremely time-consuming over many, many months. That is a convoluted, confusing process that is required of inmates who want to bring any kind of grievance inside the prison system. For people with mental illness, it's that much more difficult. The challenges for people getting help are enormous. I mean, they're staggering. And, we can't just, I can sit here and say, it's wrong, it's morally wrong, it's unconstitutional, all that. Well, that's fine and good. But for us to file this kind of lawsuit, boy, it's an enormous amount of work.
Yeah,
and I can't thank the ACLU enough. The Rhode Island ACLU and the National Prison Project, our partners, Amy Fettig, Steve Brown. We have a fabulous attorney, Jim Rollins, from the law firm Nelson Mullins, who's dedicating his time, giving that to this cause. And we have our own attorneys on staff, Ann Mulready and Brian Oddie. They're all just a fabulously committed and talented team of people who just care about this issue so very much.
Back in, I think it was 1972, a very young, a very under-sensationalized reporter named Geraldo Rivera, in a sense, broke the news on something called Willowbrook. And I probably predates your time, but Willowbrook was a mental health facility, and I use that term very loosely, in New York, Staten Island. I wonder at what point, and I wonder how, we're going to have a Willowbrook moment with regard to our correctional facilities in this country. Because what makes it even more difficult is that people have I'll call it a highly optimistic viewpoint of correctional facilities after watching probably way too much TV. You know, at facilities like this, the guards aren't getting together to have tournaments on poker tournaments or basketball tournaments. At facilities like this, they're not making special circumstances to have a dying child come in to visit. You know, that kind of stuff. That's the work of TV. The reality
Right.
of is that many of our nation's correctional facilities are brutal, inhumane places that are designed, it would seem, almost to guarantee a high level of recidivism, and just directly against the often proclaimed Christian ethic of this nation. You know, we're often reminded by social conservatives that that's the basis on this nation was founded, forgetting, of course, the redemptive nature of said Judeo-Christian religions. We somehow managed to forget that in our calculation on how we imprison people and how we engage in quote-unquote correction. You know, I wonder if it's going to have to take something like that. What is it? A case like this? And folks, by the way, you know, I've attached all the case notes to the publicity of this, and I will again attach them when we put the podcast out, so you can have a chance to review it. It is not pleasant reading. It is not holiday reading, in any sense.
No.
Yet at the same time, if you are a citizen and a human being, it should be compulsory reading, quite frankly.
Right. Well, you know, it's so interesting that you mentioned Willowbrook because, you know, that is the very investigation that led to the creation of the PNA system, of which we are.
I did not know that.
So you know, that's a very that's sort of like the birth of the PNA system that led to the first passage of the Developmental Disabilities Act, and then a series of federal bills that created PNAs across the country. But yeah, I mean, back to the humanity, and you know, you mentioned something earlier in terms of this us versus them and the political, you know, feeling today, and you know, I sometimes wonder how it is that everyone has forgotten how connected we all are, and we seem to think that we can take people who are really vulnerable, put them away so that we can't see them somewhere. And somehow that doesn't affect our own humanity, but it does. And I don't know what it's going to take in the prison system because, like you said, there's this knee-jerk response, like they deserve it. You know, they're getting what they deserve. That's not really the truth. That's just what we've begun to repeat to ourselves enough time that we start to believe it. Willowbrook, the photos and the video that Geraldo Rivera took out of Willowbrook, people couldn't ignore it any longer, but those folks, they were quote-unquote innocent, right? They weren't in prison. They were just simply put away because their families couldn't take care of them, or that's what people did in those days. They were living in the most inhumane, filthy, awful conditions that anyone could ever imagine. Whether or not we could muster, you know, public sentiment around a Willowbrook moment with the prison system, you know, I don't know.
Right.
Look at what's happening at the border, not to get into another issue, but, you know, I mean, our tolerance for this is frightening, you know?
It really is. Offline, I just spent a couple days down on the border a few weeks ago, and we could talk about that offline. People have become euthanized. People have become, it's tragic, really. And I've only got a minute or two left, but I just want to remind folks that in any situation like this, it's a very real possibility that you, or not so much you, or someone you know, will find themselves in one of these facilities that day, and will you regret the opportunity to have engaged in a full head-on challenge to this until it's too late for someone you love. Because it can and it will happen to someone you know. It's just the numbers, unfortunately. I want to continue this conversation. First of all, I want to thank you so much for coming on a Friday night. I know you've had a pretty hectic week or so. You know, this is the week that the public saw, which, as you mentioned, is the culmination, really, of months, years. If you will, of work. You know, we didn't see how the sausage was made. We didn't see the endless hours of interviews, deposition. We don't see that. So I just want to profess to you well, I guess in a sense it's weird to say this, but congratulations for bringing this to this level, so that then as a culture here in Rhode Island, we can acknowledge this. Because again, reflecting back on my prior statement, we all know each other. So guess what? You might know someone that you don't know about who's involved with this. And quite frankly, for a wonderful state like this, we can and we should do better. And it's sad that, again, it takes litigation, it takes investigative reporting and investigations to bring to a head that which the government we pay for, that behavior which they engage in. But my hat's off to your organization. I hope you'll join us frequently and give us updates as to what progress you've made, and especially what challenges you've made. Independent media in this state it's interesting. It's fragmented, but in the aggregate is a very powerful tool. And there's a lot of good people out there doing the work that a much more well-financed, more organized, more cohesive mainstream media used to do, and sadly seems to have forgotten about. But it's the beauty of independent media is that we can engage in an hour-long conversation and get into the details that 5-minute soundbite journalism sadly won't allow anymore. So again, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Well, Pat, I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to spread the word. So thanks for your support and for talking with me at such length. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, have a wonderful weekend. Folks, Mona Murray, she is, of course, the Executive Director of the Disability Rights of Rhode Island, fighting really on behalf of probably someone you know, a family member, a friend of a friend, a former coworker, ensuring that whether you're incarcerated at one level or at a completely different level, you find yourself in a physically or mentally challenged environment, that you are accorded the civil rights that really are your birthright. And there's nobility in this work. So again, my compliments.
Thank you. Same to you.
We're going to take a very quick break right now. I'm hoping he's here. As usual, we've run long, but anyone who's listened to this or will listen in the future, I think will find it that the contributions of our guests tonight have been exemplary. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, Coalition Radio US. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.